The silence of the canyon was a living thing. For 10 years, it had been Jonah's only neighbor, a constant companion that asked for nothing and offered only the stark, echoing truth of his solitude. He'd built his cabin with his own 2 hands, each log a testament to his desire to be forgotten by the world of men. The land was hard, a patchwork of rock and dust and stubborn cedar, but it was honest. It did not lie or betray. It simply was. His life was a rhythm of simple, necessary actions: chopping wood, drawing water, tending to the small herd of goats that was his only company. He had forgotten the sound of another human voice, and the memory of it was a faded, painless scar. He was tracking a wounded goat up a dry wash when he found her. She was lying in the sliver of shade cast by a sandstone overhang, a splash of dark color against the pale rock. For a moment, his mind refused to accept what he was seeing. She was a native woman. Her black hair fanned out around her head like a raven's wing. Her face was flushed with fever, her breathing shallow and ragged. She was dying. Jonah stopped, his rifle held loosely in his hand. He was a man who lived by a simple code: you do not get involved. Involvement was the hook that pulled you back into the world of pain and loss and grief that he had fled so long ago. He should have turned around, walked away, and let nature take its course. The canyon was full of death. It was the natural order of things. He looked at her, at the deerskin dress torn and travel-stained, at the intricate beadwork on her moccasins, now scuffed and broken. She was young, too young. A flicker of something, a feeling he had long since buried, stirred in his chest. It was the ghost of a memory, of another woman, another fever, another helpless, lonely death. He cursed under his breath, the sound harsh and alien in the quiet wash. He knew he would not leave her. The code he lived by had just been broken by a stronger, older law, one that a man does not choose but is born with. He knelt beside her, his movements slow and deliberate, so as not to startle her if she were to wake. He touched his calloused hand to her forehead. She was burning with heat. He looked up at the sky, at the sun beating down on the canyon rim. He had to get her out of the heat. With a grunt, he gently lifted her into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, a fragile weight against his chest. He began the slow, careful walk back to his cabin, his long shadow stretching out before him, a solitary man carrying a stranger, a past he could not escape, and a future he could not predict. The cabin, his fortress of solitude, felt instantly violated by her presence. He laid her on his own cot, the only soft place in the hard, spare room. For a moment, he simply stood there, looking down at her, a stranger in his bed, an unwelcome complication in his carefully ordered life. The silence of the room was different now. It was not the empty, peaceful silence he was used to. It was a silence filled with the ragged sound of her breathing, a sound that was a constant reminder of the choice he had made. He went about his work with a grim efficiency. He drew fresh, cool water from the well, and tearing a strip from a clean linen shirt, began to bathe her forehead. Her skin was dry and hot to the touch. He worked with a detached, mechanical precision, his face a mask of stone. He was not helping a person. He was performing a task, a problem to be solved. As he tended to her, he noticed the details. A long, ugly gash on her arm, crudely stitched and inflamed. The dark bruises on her wrists. The exhaustion etched so deeply onto her features that it seemed carved into the bone. She was not just sick. She was a survivor of some terrible violence. This knowledge did not comfort him. It only deepened his unease. He had not invited a sick woman into his home. He had invited trouble. He brewed a tea from the willow bark he kept for his own aches and pains, a bitter concoction to fight the fever. He gently lifted her head and forced a few spoonfuls of the liquid between her cracked lips. Most of it dribbled down her chin, but some of it went down. It was the best he could do. For 2 days and 2 nights he kept vigil. He did not sleep. He sat in his hard wooden chair across the room, his rifle across his lap, and watched her. He listened to her fevered muttering, a language he did not understand, but whose tones of fear and sorrow were universal. He saw the ghosts that haunted her sleep, the way she would cry out, her hands flailing as if to ward off a blow. And in her troubled sleep, he saw the reflection of his own. He was a man haunted by ghosts, a man who had fled to the loneliest place he could find to escape them. And now he had brought another haunted soul into his sanctuary. On the third morning, the fever broke. He woke from a light doze in his chair to find her eyes open. They were dark and clear, and they were watching him. The fear in them was sharp and immediate. She tried to sit up, a gasp of pain escaping her lips. Jonah didn't move. He simply sat there, his face impassive, and let her look. Let her see that he was not an immediate threat. He made no move toward her. He gave her the space to overcome her fear. The silence stretched, broken only by the crackle of the fire in the hearth. Finally, her gaze fell upon the empty bowl and the cup on the small table beside the cot. She looked at the clean bandage on her arm. She looked back at him, and the fear in her eyes was replaced by a cautious, wary understanding. He had not harmed her. He had helped her. He stood slowly, his movements deliberate, and went to the hearth. He ladled a thin broth into a clean bowl and brought it to her. He did not speak. Words were a currency he no longer traded in. He simply offered the bowl. She hesitated for a moment, her pride warring with her weakness. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, she took the bowl from his hands. Their fingers brushed, a brief, fleeting contact that sent a jolt through Jonah, a shock of human connection he had not felt in a decade. He retreated to his chair, to the safety of his solitude, and picked up a piece of wood he had been carving. He began to work the wood with his knife, not looking at her, but aware of her every movement, of the soft scrape of the spoon against the bowl, of the quiet, steady sound of her breathing. The fever was gone, but a new, more complicated tension had taken its place. His cabin was no longer just a shelter. It was a shared space, a fragile truce between two wounded, solitary worlds. She healed slowly, her body and spirit mending in the quiet sanctuary of the cabin. She never told him her name, and he never asked. She was simply the woman, a silent presence that moved through his home with a quiet, unobtrusive grace. As her strength returned, she began to contribute. She would mend his worn clothes with a skill that spoke of long practice, her small, neat stitches a stark contrast to his own clumsy repairs. She would sweep the floor with a handmade broom of bundled twigs. She would grind corn into meal with a smooth stone she found by the creek. She was not trying to earn her keep. She was trying to restore her own dignity, to find her place in this strange temporary life. Jonah watched her, his face a mask of indifference, but his eyes missed nothing. He saw the way she would pause by the window, her gaze lost in the vast, empty expanse of the canyon, a look of profound sorrow and longing on her face. He saw the way she would flinch if he moved too quickly, the deeply ingrained reflex of someone who had known great cruelty. They lived in a world of silence, their communication a sparse and simple language of gestures and shared tasks. He would leave a bucket of water by the door, and later find it full. She would leave a plate of food on the table for him when he came in from his work. They were two planets in a small, enclosed orbit, maintaining a careful distance, yet inextricably bound by the gravity of their shared solitude. One evening, she found him by the two small graves that stood on a rise behind the cabin. He was clearing the weeds that had grown around the simple wooden crosses, his movements slow and reverent. She stood a respectful distance away, her hands clasped before her, a silent acknowledgment of his private grief. He did not send her away. Her quiet presence was not an intrusion. It was a comfort. He finished his work and stood, his back to her, looking out at the canyon as the sun began to set. "My wife and my daughter," he said, his voice a rough, gravelly thing, unused to speaking of such matters. "Fever. 10 years ago." He did not say more. He did not need to. The words hung in the air, a stark and simple epitaph for the life he had lost, the life that had driven him to this empty place. She did not offer words of sympathy. She knew, as he did, that such words were useless in the face of such a loss. Instead, she knelt and placed a small, smooth river stone on each of the graves, a simple, silent gesture of respect. It was an offering, a bridge between her world and his, a recognition of their shared humanity. That night, she spoke for the first time. Her voice was soft, melodic, but held an undercurrent of strength. She told him her name was Amaya. She did not tell him her story. Not yet. But in the sharing of her name, she was sharing a piece of herself. She was offering a thread of trust in the quiet darkness of the cabin. And Jonah, a man who thought his heart had turned to stone, felt that thread begin to wrap itself around him, pulling him slowly, inexorably, back into the world of the living. The trust between them grew like a desert flower, a rare and fragile thing blooming in a harsh and unforgiving landscape. It was not built on words, but on small, unspoken actions. He began to leave the cabin unlocked when he went out to work his land, a silent declaration that he no longer saw her as a threat. She, in turn, began to tend to the small garden he had neglected since his family's death, her patient hands coaxing life back into the dry, tired earth. One afternoon, he returned to the cabin to find her weeping silently, her shoulders shaking with a grief she could no longer contain. He stopped in the doorway, uncertain. The pain of others was a territory he had long since abandoned. His instinct was to retreat, to leave her to her sorrow, but he found he could not. He walked to the hearth, stoked the fire, and put on a pot of coffee, his movements a familiar, comforting ritual. He did not speak to her, did not touch her. He simply stayed. He was a silent, solid presence in the room, a rock in the turbulent sea of her grief. And when her tears had passed, she began to talk. She told him of her people, the people of the blue water. She told him of their peaceful village, nestled deep in a hidden canyon like this one. And she told him of the men who had come, men with faces like hungry walls, men looking for the yellow rock that drove them to madness. They had fallen upon her village without warning, their guns spitting fire and death. They had taken everything, their food, their horses, their sacred objects, and they had taken the women. Amaya had escaped, wounded and alone, fleeing into the wilderness with the screams of her people echoing in her memory. She did not know if any others had survived. She had been wandering for weeks, her strength failing, when he had found her. Her story settled in the small cabin, a tale of brutality and loss that resonated with the tragedy of Jonah's own life. His wife and daughter had been taken by the casual indifference of disease. Her people had been destroyed by the deliberate, calculated greed of men. He looked at her, at the raw pain in her eyes, and the last of the walls around his heart crumbled. His hatred, the cold, abstract hatred he had nurtured for the people he blamed for his family's death, withered in the face of her specific, terrible grief. She was not an enemy. She was a survivor. Just like him. "The men who did this," he said, his voice a low growl. "Do you know where they went?" "They spoke of a place called Miller's Creek," she said. "They said the yellow rock was plentiful there." Jonah knew Miller's Creek. It was a rough mining camp, a 3-day ride to the north, a place where the law was thin and life was cheap. He stood and went to the pegs on the wall where he kept his gear. He took down his heavy coat, his saddlebags, his spare ammunition. Amaya watched him, a dawning understanding in her eyes. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice a whisper. "I'm going to Miller's Creek," he said, his voice flat and hard. He was not a man of vengeance. He had buried that part of himself with his family. But he was a man of justice. And justice, in this land, was something you often had to make for yourself. He was no longer just a man hiding from his past. He was a man with a purpose. He was going to help her find her people. He left at dawn the next day. He packed enough supplies for a week, leaving Amaya with a rifle and enough food and firewood to last until he returned. The parting was unspoken, a long, meaningful look between two people who had found a fragile connection in a world that had tried to break them both. He rode north, the familiar landscape of his solitude now looking different, charged with a new and dangerous purpose. He was re-entering the world he had forsaken, and he did not know what he would find there. Miller's Creek was less a town than a festering sore on the face of the desert. It was a haphazard collection of tents, crude shacks, and a single long saloon, all clinging to the banks of a muddy, silt-choked stream. The air was thick with the smell of cheap whiskey, unwashed bodies, and the metallic tang of desperation. Men with hard, empty eyes watched him as he rode down the main thoroughfare, their gazes lingering on his rifle and the quality of his horse. This was a place where a man's life was worth less than the contents of his pockets. Jonah was not intimidated. He had seen places like this before, in the life he had lived before the silence. He dismounted in front of the saloon, the only place to gather information, and went inside. The saloon was dark and smoky, the air buzzing with the low murmur of conversations and the clink of glasses. He walked to the bar and ordered a whiskey, his eyes scanning the room, taking in the faces, listening to the snippets of talk. He was looking for men who fit Amaya's description, men who carried the arrogance of recent victory, men who might be careless with their words. He found them in a back corner, a group of 4 men playing poker, their voices loud and their laughter brutal. They were spending money freely, and on the table, next to a pile of coins, lay a necklace of intricate silver and turquoise beadwork. It was a beautiful piece of craftsmanship, and it was identical to the one Amaya wore. Jonah felt a cold, hard knot form in his stomach. He drank his whiskey slowly, listening. The men were bragging. They spoke of a walkover of a tribe of savages who had been taught a lesson. They laughed about the women they had taken, their words crude and dehumanizing. One of them, a big man with a red, bloated face, mentioned that the women were being held at their camp a few miles up the canyon until we get tired of him. The casual cruelty of the man's words sent a wave of cold fury through Jonah. He finished his whiskey, set the glass down on the bar, and walked toward the men's table. He was 1 man against 4. The odds were not in his favor, but he was not driven by logic. He was driven by a cold, clear sense of right and wrong. He stopped at their table. The 4 men looked up, their faces a mixture of surprise and annoyance. "The necklace," Jonah said, his voice quiet but carrying a weight that made the men pause. "Where did you get it?" The big man with the red face laughed, a short, ugly bark. "Finders keepers, old man," he said. "Now move along before you get hurt." Jonah didn't move. His gaze was fixed on the man's face, his eyes as cold and hard as river stones. "I'm not asking again," he said. The man's smile faded. He saw something in Jonah's eyes that he hadn't expected. He saw a man who had nothing left to lose, a man who was not afraid of death, his own or anyone else's. The man slowly began to reach for the pistol at his belt. He never made it. Jonah's hand was a blur, his own Colt Peacemaker seeming to leap into his grasp. The roar of the gun was deafening in the enclosed space. The big man was thrown backward out of his chair, a look of shocked disbelief on his face. The other 3 men scrambled for their weapons, but they were too slow. Jonah fired twice more, his movements economical and deadly. The saloon erupted into chaos. Men shouted and dove for cover. Jonah ignored them. He stood over the fallen men, the smoke coiling from the barrel of his gun, his face a grim, emotionless mask. He had not come here for a fight, but a fight had found him. He reached down and picked up the turquoise necklace from the table. Then he turned and walked out of the saloon, leaving behind a scene of sudden, brutal violence. He knew he had just kicked a hornet's nest. The rest of the miners would be after him now. He had to get to the camp, and he had to get there fast. He rode out of Miller's Creek as if the devil himself were on his heels, the sounds of shouting and angry gunfire fading behind him. He followed the canyon upstream, the tracks of the miners' horses clear in the soft earth. He rode hard, pushing his horse, knowing that time was his enemy. He found the camp nestled in a small box canyon, a tributary of the main creek. It was a crude setup, just a few tents and a large corral holding a dozen or so horses, including several native ponies. A single guard was posted at the mouth of the canyon, a lanky youth who was paying more attention to a bottle of whiskey than to his surroundings. Jonah dismounted and approached on foot, his movements silent and fluid, a ghost in the deepening twilight. He took the guard out from behind, a single swift blow to the back of the head with the butt of his pistol. The boy went down without a sound. There were 3 other men in the camp, gathered around a fire, drinking and laughing, oblivious to his presence. And then he saw them. In a makeshift rope pen at the back of the camp, huddled together like frightened animals, were 5 native women. One of them, an old woman with a face of noble dignity, looked up and saw him. Her eyes widened, but she gave no sign. Jonah knew he could not take on the 3 men by himself in a direct assault. He had to use the terrain, the darkness, the element of surprise. He circled the camp, climbing up the steep canyon wall until he was positioned on a ledge directly above them. From here, he could see the entire layout. The men were heavily armed, their rifles leaning against a rock near the fire. He waited. He waited for the whiskey to do its work, for their senses to dull, for their watchfulness to fade. The moon rose, casting long, eerie shadows across the canyon floor. The men's laughter grew louder, their movements more clumsy. The time had come. He took careful aim with his rifle, not at the men, but at the large coffee pot sitting on the fire's grate. He fired. The pot exploded with a loud bang, sending a shower of boiling water and hot coals over the startled men. They yelled in surprise and pain, jumping back from the fire, momentarily blinded and confused. In that instant of chaos, Jonah fired again, this time at the lantern hanging from a tree branch, plunging the camp into near total darkness. "They're here!" One of the men screamed, firing his pistol wildly into the shadows. Jonah used the confusion to his advantage. He scrambled down from the ledge, and under the cover of darkness and their own panicked gunfire, he made his way to the rope pen. He sliced through the ropes with his hunting knife. "Go," he whispered to the women in the darkness. "Get to the horses. Run." The women did not hesitate. They moved with a silent, desperate speed, melting into the shadows like ghosts. The old woman paused for a second, her hand gripping his arm with surprising strength. "The people of the blue water will not forget this," she said, her voice a low, fierce whisper. Then she was gone. Jonah did not follow them. His job was not done. He had to create a diversion to give them time to escape. He let out a loud yell and fired his pistol into the air, drawing the miners' attention to his position at the far side of the camp. "He's over here," one of them shouted. They began firing into the darkness where his muzzle flash had been. He returned fire, not aiming to kill, but to keep them pinned down. He was a shadow, moving from rock to rock, firing from different positions, creating the illusion of a larger attacking force. He could hear the thunder of hoofbeats in the distance as the women drove the stolen horses out of the corral and up the canyon. They were free. His diversion had worked. But now he was trapped, with 3 angry, heavily armed men between him and his own horse. He was low on ammunition, and the first light of dawn was beginning to touch the canyon rim. His time was running out. He was pressed behind a large boulder, the air around him singing with the whine of ricocheting bullets. The miners had spread out, and they were beginning to close in, their movements more cautious now, more methodical. They were hunting him. Jonah knew his situation was dire. He had 2 bullets left in his pistol, and 1 in his rifle. He had to make them count. He peered around the edge of the boulder, trying to get a sense of their positions. He saw one of them, a dark shape moving among the rocks to his left. He raised his rifle, took a steadying breath, and fired his last rifle round. The man cried out and fell. 2 down, 2 to go. But now they knew exactly where he was. Bullets slammed into the boulder, chipping off fragments of rock that stung his face. He was pinned down, his position exposed. The other 2 men were advancing on him from opposite sides, a classic pincer movement. He was caught in a deadly crossfire. He holstered his empty rifle and drew his Colt. 2 bullets left. He had a choice to make. He could try to take both men with him, a final desperate act of defiance. Or he could try to do the unthinkable, the impossible. He could try to surrender. But he knew these men. They were not the kind to take prisoners. His only hope was to break through their line and make a run for his horse. It was a slim chance, a fool's hope, but it was the only one he had. He took a deep breath, preparing to make his move when he heard it. It was a low, rumbling sound at first, a vibration that he felt in the soles of his boots more than he heard with his ears. It grew steadily louder, a sound like distant thunder, but there were no clouds in the pale dawn sky. The 2 miners heard it too. They stopped their advance, their heads turning, their faces etched with a confused uncertainty. The sound grew into a roar, the unmistakable thunder of hundreds of galloping horses, echoing off the high canyon walls. And then they appeared. At the mouth of the canyon, silhouetted against the rising sun, was a sight that made Jonah's blood run cold. Warriors, hundreds of them. They sat on their painted ponies, their faces grim, their lances and rifles held at the ready. They were a vision from a nightmare, a wave of silent, deadly force poised to crash down upon the small canyon. The 2 miners stared, their faces frozen in a mask of pure terror. They had been so focused on their one-man prey that they had not seen the army that had crept up behind them. Jonah understood instantly. The old woman, she had not just fled. She had gone for help, and she had found it. The warriors did not charge. They sat, a silent, menacing line, blocking the only exit from the canyon. Then a single rider emerged from their ranks. He rode forward slowly, his body painted for war, a magnificent eagle feather headdress trailing behind him. He was a chief, a leader, a man of great power and authority. He rode not toward the 2 terrified miners, but toward Jonah's position. He stopped a few yards from Jonah's boulder and raised a hand, palm open, a sign of peace. Jonah, his mind reeling from the sudden impossible turn of events, slowly stood up from behind the rock, his empty hands raised to show he was no threat. The chief's eyes, dark and piercing, studied him for a long moment. Then he spoke, his voice deep and resonant, a voice accustomed to command. "You are the one they call the Gray Man of the Canyon?" he asked in perfect English. Jonah could only nod, stunned into silence. He had been given that name by the few prospectors who had stumbled upon his remote cabin over the years, a name he had always hated. "I am called Black Eagle," the chief said, "and the woman you saved is my daughter." The revelation struck Jonah with the force of a physical blow. Amaya, a chief's daughter. The pieces of the puzzle fell into place. The violence of the attack on her village, the desperation of her flight, the importance of her survival. She was not just a woman. She was a symbol, the future of her people. The 2 surviving miners, seeing the exchange, threw down their weapons, their faces ashen with terror. They understood, as Jonah now did, that they were not just facing a single, angry man. They were facing the righteous fury of an entire nation. Black Eagle gave a sharp command in his own language. A dozen warriors dismounted, and with a swift, brutal efficiency, seized the two miners. Their fate would be decided by tribal law, and Jonah knew that law would be harsh, but just. Black Eagle turned his attention back to Jonah. His expression was unreadable, a mixture of gratitude, suspicion, and a deep, ingrained authority. "My daughter told us what you did," he said. "You fought for her. You saved her and the other women. You have spilled the blood of our enemies. For this my people are in your debt." Jonah did not know what to say. He was a man of few words, and in this moment they failed him completely. He simply nodded, his mind still struggling to comprehend the scale of what was happening. "Come," Black Eagle said, gesturing for Jonah to walk with him. "You will ride with us. My daughter is waiting." They walked back to the mouth of the canyon, the hundreds of warriors parting before them like a sea, their dark eyes following Jonah's every move. He was an outsider, a white man in the heart of a native army. He should have been terrified. But he was not. He felt a strange sense of calm, of belonging. He had stumbled into a story far larger than his own, and he had found his place in it. Amaya was waiting for them, her face filled with a relief so profound it was painful to see. She ran to her father, and they embraced, a moment of pure, heartfelt emotion. Then she turned to Jonah. She did not speak. She simply took his hand, her grip firm and warm, and led him toward a fine-looking pony that a young warrior was holding for him. He mounted, feeling out of place and conspicuous. The war party turned and began to ride out of the canyon, a silent, formidable river of men and horses. Jonah rode between Amaya and her father, a guest of honor in a procession that only hours before he would have considered his worst nightmare. They rode for a full day, climbing out of the low desert and into the high wooded country of the mountains. They moved with a silent, relentless purpose, their numbers stretching for nearly a mile along the narrow trail. Jonah had never seen anything like it. It was a display of power and organization that few white men ever witnessed. He rode in silence, observing, listening. He learned that the people of the Blue Water were not a small, isolated band, but a large and powerful tribe, with a vast territory that they had defended for centuries. The attack on Amaya's village had been an isolated incident. A raid by a small group of opportunistic prospectors who had foolishly mistaken a small winter camp for the entire tribe. Black Eagle had been tracking the miners for a week, his war party gathering strength as runners were sent to the outlying villages. Amaya's escape and the information provided by the old woman Jonah had freed had led them to this final confrontation. They arrived at the main village at sunset. It was a place of breathtaking beauty, a collection of sturdy, well-made lodges nestled in a valley blessed with a clear, running river and groves of tall pine. This was not a primitive camp. It was a town, a community, a civilization. And as Jonah rode into the center of it a hero to these people he had once considered his enemies, he felt the last of his old life, the last of his carefully nurtured hatred and solitude fall away like dust. He was no longer the gray man of the canyon. He was a man who had found his way back into the world. Jonah was treated not as a stranger, but as a revered guest. He was given a lodge of his own, furnished with warm furs and woven blankets. He was invited to eat at the chief's fire, a place of high honor. He sat with Black Eagle and the tribe's elders, and they spoke for many hours. They were curious about him, about his life, about the world beyond their mountain sanctuary. They were intelligent, thoughtful men, their questions sharp and insightful. They were not the savages of his prejudice. They were leaders, statesmen, philosophers. Jonah, in turn, found himself speaking more than he had in 10 years. He told them of his life, of his loss, of the grief that had driven him into the wilderness. He spoke of the white man's world, of its greed, its restlessness, its casual cruelty. He spoke the truth as he saw it, and they listened, their faces thoughtful and grave. He stayed with them for a week that felt like a lifetime. He walked with Amaya by the river, and she showed him the plants and animals of her home. She was different here. She was not the frightened, wounded refugee he had found in the desert. She was a princess, a leader in her own right, her voice respected in the councils of her people. She was strong, intelligent, and filled with a grace that captivated him. He found himself drawn to her, not just with gratitude, but with a deeper, more profound emotion, an emotion he thought had died in him long ago. He was a man in his 40s, his face and hands weathered by a hard life. She was a young woman in her prime. The gulf between their worlds, their ages, their histories, seemed impossibly wide. And yet, in the quiet moments they spent together, that gulf seemed to disappear. They were simply two people who had seen the worst of the world, and had found in each other a reason to believe in the best of it. On the last day of his stay, Black Eagle summoned him to the council lodge. The elders were all present. The mood was solemn, formal. "You have done a great service to my people," Black Eagle said, his voice echoing in the large space. "You have shown us that courage and honor are not bound by the color of a man's skin. We wish to honor you in the way of our people." He presented Jonah with a magnificent war pony, its coat the color of fresh cream, and a rifle encased in a beautifully beaded scabbard. They were gifts of immense value, symbols of the tribe's respect and gratitude. "You will always be a friend to the people of the Blue Water," Black Eagle said. "Our home is your home. You are welcome here always." Jonah was deeply moved, his heart too full for words. He could only nod his acceptance, his gratitude. The time had come for him to leave. He had a ranch to return to, a life that was waiting for him. But the thought of returning to his solitude, to the silence of the canyon, now filled him with a profound sadness. He sought out Amaya to say his goodbyes. He found her by the river, watching the water flow over the smooth, colored stones. "You are leaving," she said. It was not a question. "I have to," he said. "It is my home." "Is your home a place of logs and stone?" she asked, her dark eyes searching his. "Or is it a place where your heart can be at peace?" Her question struck him with the force of a revelation. He looked at his hands, the hands that had built his cabin, the hands that had fought for her people, the hands that longed to reach out and touch her. He had built a shelter of logs and stone to hide from his grief. But he had found a home for his heart here, in this impossible, unexpected place. He had a choice to make. He could return to the past, to the safety of his solitude, to the lonely ghost of the man he had been. Or he could choose the future, a future that was uncertain, complicated, and filled with the terrifying, beautiful promise of a new life, a new family, a new love. He looked at her strong, beautiful face, at the hope that shone in her eyes, and he knew his journey was not over. It was just beginning. He did not ride out of the valley alone. He rode out with a new purpose, a new life unfolding before him. He had spent a decade building walls to keep the world out, only to discover that true strength lay in tearing them down. He had sought peace in the silence of solitude, but had found it in the voice of a woman and the heart of a people he had been taught to hate. He returned to his canyon not as a final destination, but as a place of transition. He packed his few belongings, rounded up his small herd of goats, and made the journey back to the village of the people of the Blue Water. He did not know what his role would be, how he would fit into their world. He was a man between two lives, a bridge between two cultures. But for the first time in a very long time, he was not afraid of the unknown. He was welcomed not as a guest this time, but as a member of the tribe, a brother, a son. He built a new cabin with the help of his new family, near the river, its porch facing the rising sun. He and Amaya were married in the tradition of her people, their union a symbol of the peace and understanding that could exist between two worlds. He learned their language, their customs, their stories. He taught them what he knew of his own world, of its dangers and its wonders. He became a counselor to Black Eagle, his wisdom and experience a valuable asset to the tribe. He was a man of peace, but his presence, and the legend of the gray man who had defended them, served as a powerful deterrent to those who would seek to harm the people of the Blue Water. He lived a long and full life, a life he never could have imagined in the lonely silence of his canyon. He saw children grow and grandchildren born. He saw his two worlds, the one he was born into, and the one he had chosen, begin to find a common ground, a shared path forward. He was a living testament to the idea that the deepest prejudices can be overcome, that the most profound wounds can be healed, and that the family you find is sometimes more powerful than the one you lose. He was buried on a hill overlooking the valley, next to the graves of the ancestors of his adopted people. There was no cross, only a simple stone marker, a silent testament to a man who had lost everything and in doing so had found it all. So here our story ends. A tale of a man who offered shelter to a single sick woman and, in doing so, opened his heart to a nation. It begs us to ask ourselves, how often do we let fear and prejudice build the walls of our own solitude? And what miracles might we find if we have the courage to open the door to a stranger? Let us know what you think in the comments below.